Welcome, everybody, to our sixth Fireside Chat of the year. Tonight's topic is on wildlife habitat, one of my favorite topics. And we've got, I think, a few more folks rolling in yet, so I'm going to burn just a little bit of time here with some introductions while a few more folks log in. My name is Kirk Hanson. I'm the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. And it's my distinct pleasure to be able to work all over the Pacific Northwest, mostly with small woodland owners and conservation groups practicing what we call ecological forestry. And obviously central to the practice of ecological forestry is both conserving and enhancing wildlife habitat. A lot of folks that come to us, a lot of forest owners that come to us, their primary interest is in enhancing the overall habitat values and wildlife opportunities on their land. So even though I'm not a professional wildlife biologist, I feel like I've paid attention over the past few years, picked up a few tips and tricks. Certainly have worked extensively with wildlife biologists. And I've had all sorts of opportunity to implement different wildlife habitat enhancement projects on a variety of different forest lands. So as has been the nature with all of these fireside chats, even though I'm not a specialist on any of the topics that we cover, this is perspective from a forester, practicing forester. And in that way, I hope that the information that we provide is a little more accessible to you as forest owners, forest managers, forest practitioners. Tonight, I'm joined by Alex Stolk. Alex is always running this whole show behind the scenes and making sure that things go smoothly. Alex is also going to be checking the chat box. So as I go through my presentation on wildlife habitat, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll wrap up in about a half hour, and Alex will pull from those questions, comments, share those. You can also hold on to them, and I should be talking for about a half hour or so, and then I'm going to open it up for a general discussion and really want to hear from all of you what kinds of things you are doing as forest managers, or what kind of ideas you have as wildlife enthusiasts for what we can do to enhance habitat values in forests that are close to us. Just a little bit more about NNRG and our educational programs. Aside from this ongoing series of fireside chats, we have a whole bunch of workshops coming up this year. The first one, these are in-person workshops, and I'm grateful to say finally, first one is on July 9th in Quilcene and is on the economics and principles of commercially thinning overstocked forests. We'll be visiting a forest that we just recently thinned and walk folks through it and talk about both some of the ecological forestry practices that we've woven into this thinning project, as well as the economics of it. You can find information on that workshop and all of our future workshops on our website if you go to nnrg.org. And then also relative to this topic, wildlife habitat, we have a lot of information on our website, as well as several publications that Alex has primarily helped pull together on the topic of wildlife. And again, if you go to nnrg.org and click on the resources tab, you'll find a page specifically dedicated to wildlife habitat. So with that as an introduction, I think I'll assume that we're at capacity for this evening. And I am going to, Alex, is there anything else that I should mention or?
No, except that any other resources you mentioned during this chat today, I'll compile into an email and send by email afterwards. So if you happen to not find the link just by Google searching, I'll be sending them out.
All right, thank you. And also, yeah, true to form with our Fireside Chat so far for the past previous 5 chats, I've actually been able to broadcast live from my functioning fire. And here we are, June 15th, and it was still cool enough today that I got the wood stove going. So there it is, cooking away behind me, and hopefully this time next month we'll be past the wood stove season. As hard as it is for me to say that, but I am looking forward to warmer temperatures. So I'm going to share, open up my presentation here. And Alex, can you confirm that that's actually working?
Yeah, it looks good.
Fantastic. Okay. Minimize a few screens. Okay. So where I want to start, let's see here. Okay, there we go. I'm sorry. Yeah, because as I mentioned, if you go to our website, nnrg.org, and over here on the click on the resources tab, we have information on all different kinds of topics and one page dedicated specifically to wildlife. So you'll find a lot of good information there. So the first thing that I want to talk about relative to wildlife, I and my organization work with a broad range of forest owner types, people that own as few as just 5 acres to folks that own over 5,000 acres. And I find that it's often with the smaller woodland owners that they're very interested in optimizing wildlife habitat for every kind of species that they possibly can. And I think that comes from well-intentioned enthusiasm. But one of the first things that I say to them is, one, you should not really expect to be able to optimize habitat for every type of wildlife that is occupying your area. It's going to be nearly impossible to, especially on a small tract of forest land. But it also, could be time, a lot of time wasted as you strive to create, all of these different habitat types on a small tract of land. And what I instead encourage folks to do is think a little more at a landscape level and think about where your property sits in the overall landscape. This is an aerial view of one of my family's tracts of forest land a little bit south of Olympia. And even just looking at this, looking at the forest cover and the land use types surrounding our land, you can see that there are a lot of different habitat types. If you're accustomed to looking at aerial photos and discerning forest cover, you'll see that in this roughly 1 mile radius around our land, we have a combination of stands dominated by hardwoods, stands that are dominated by conifers. There are recent clear cuts. There are very young forests. This will be hard to tell from the picture, but there are wetlands, there are streams, et cetera, et cetera. So a broad range of habitat types at a landscape level. And once you understand what types of habitat, forest-based habitat there are in proximity to your land, then the next thing that I encourage you to think about is what are the underrepresented forest habitat types. And it's there that you may want to begin focusing, if you have the opportunity to manage your property for a long period of time, is starting to build on and increase some of those underrepresented habitats. So for instance, older forests. Obviously, we have converted the vast majority of our forested landscape to young plantations. And older forest types, forests older than 60, 80 years, I would consider to be underrepresented. So if there's one thing that you do, it could be just growing older forests or extending the rotation age of your forest. by that same token, again, a lot of our landscape, like I mentioned, has been converted to even age homogeneous plantations, Douglas fir plantations, not a lot of habitat diversity in those types of forests. So managing for mixed species and mixed age forests also is an opportunity to bring in an underrepresented forest habitat type. Then there are a lot of structures within a forest that are really important to wildlife that oftentimes are missing in younger forests and in particular in young plantations. And two key structures for wildlife are snags, which are standing dead trees, and down logs, or what we often call coarse woody debris. If you go into any second, third, even fourth generation forest, oftentimes these dead wood structures are completely absent or have rotted away decades ago. And we know that there are literally dozens of species and hundreds of insects that depend on dead wood in the forest for a portion of their habitat needs. And there are some species that are entirely dependent on large dead wood, the pileated woodpecker and other cavity-dependent species. So retaining and or recruiting these kinds of structures, dead wood structures, is also an opportunity to bring underrepresented forest structures back into your forest. Hardwoods, again, with our landscape being dominated by conifer plantations, allowing hardwoods to prosper in your forest, or even planting more diverse hardwoods is a great way to increase habitat opportunities for wildlife. And then lastly, again, this is more dependent on what's going on around your property, but creating or increasing what we call early successional or early cereal shrub dominant habitat. So again, I'd say if you're in a landscape that is dominated by plantations and there is even forest cover, even forest distribution across the landscape, and not a lot of openings or not a lot of young forest out there, very young, less than 20 years old, where the canopy is still open, then creating some early successional, some gaps, some openings where shrubs are dominant will bring in or provide some important habitat opportunities. Browse for ungulates, deer, and elk, as well as flowering plants for pollinators and berry and nut producing shrubs for birds and other wildlife that forage on those kinds of that kind of food source. So that's just a little thought about bringing in, again, underrepresented forest types. So once you've kind of taken a little more global look at where your forest sits in the landscape and understand either what it presents that's not present on the landscape and what's potential are, then the second thing is to just take the time for good old-fashioned observation, going out and spending a fair amount of time in your land and looking for signs of wildlife. People often ask me, well, what types of wildlife species can I expect to occupy my forest? And I'd say, the answer is right there in your forest. Go out, spend some time, look for wildlife tracks, look for signs of browse, listen for bird species, bird diversity, look for tracks on bare soil, or just, again, direct sightings of wildlife, and begin making notes and observations of where you see the wildlife, when, what time of day, what time of year, what parts of your forest are they occupying, and take photos. Begin keeping records, an annual or a ongoing journal of wildlife observations. For those of you that are not birdologists, like my sister, who's on the meeting tonight, and have a hard time identifying birds by their bird calls, I was just introduced to a fascinating app called a cell phone app called Merlin, and this was developed by the Cornell Ornithology Lab. And if you can hear birds calling, you can turn on this app, hold up your phone, and it will hear the bird call and identify that bird. So for folks like myself that haven't tuned their ears in yet to the bird calls, here's a great way to begin learning about the different birds that are occupying your forest. And then one of the last strategies that falls under observation is putting in GPS points. So I always encourage folks to use some kind of GPS system, just even on their phone. Could be a Venza Maps, or could be some kind of hiking app that allows you to put in waypoints where you can identify or mark rather important wildlife observations. Again, maybe it's wildlife trails, maybe it was wildlife sighting, maybe it's a photo, and you can keep a log of that. Most of these apps allow you to download information that you can then upload in Google Earth, which I think is a great repository for all this information. And then you can pull it up readily and begin looking at where wildlife are using different parts of your forest. So the other thing is to, of course, beyond just making observations, is get a better sense of what should live there. And for those of you, again, like myself, that are not professional wildlife biologists, there's a lot of great resources that we can turn to get an understanding of what kind of wildlife should be occupying, either our forest or certainly the region within which our forest occupies. And one of the first resources I suggest you go to is your State Department of Natural Resources or State Department of Fish and Wildlife. Either will have wildlife biologists that can talk to you on the phone at a minimum, if not come out to your forest and walk around with you, and both help you identify wildlife, signs of wildlife, and or what type of wildlife likely would be occupying your forest given the forest composition. So that's the first place to start, bringing out professional wildlife habitat biologist. Another great tool, let's see if I have this here. And this is just for folks in the state of Washington. There may be something equivalent in other states, but here in Washington, our Department of Fish and Wildlife has a lot of information on their website about what they call priority habitats and species. So these are the wildlife species that are listed as species of concern, if not threatened, rare, or endangered. You can find a list of all of these species, as well as the maps of their habitat ranges. And so when looking at those maps, you can identify where your property is and see whether or not the habitat range of some of these listed species may overlap with your property. And that may be another place to focus is, as well as creating general habitat options for wildlife in general, is starting to look at creating habitat opportunities for very specific wildlife. My prior slide, the pileated woodpecker, for instance, I'm working on an interesting project for a private forest owner right now who's very interested in pileated woodpecker conservation. And one of the things that we know about pileateds is that they require large diameter trees, both live and dead, for their roosting and nesting habitat. And so with this particular landowner, since the pileated is a specific species of interest for them, we're looking at their forest from the standpoint of, can we convert some of their large trees into snags? Can we modify those trees using various strategies to improve their habitat values for the pileated woodpecker? So we've got two kind of general strategies there, creating a breadth of wildlife habitat types to attract just a broad range of wildlife, and starting to focus in on some very specific wildlife species, and getting back again to these priority habitat and species. There's a lot of information on this website that can tell you about the habitat needs of these specific species. And again, you can then go to your forest and say, well, does my forest already provide that? Or with what I've learned now about this type of habitat, can I begin creating that within my forest? And one thing I also want to mention is that, not all wildlife are fuzzy and cute. Some of them let's broaden our definition of wildlife, are beetles or slugs. These are two actually endangered species within Washington that are on the priority habitat and species list. And I just realized now that I forgot to write down their names. So that'll be somewhat unsatisfying for some of you, I'm sure. But yeah, believe it or not, and I don't know how they figured this out, there is a beetle species that is endangered, and I think it's called the blue slipped slug. So it's kind of interesting when you look at that list of species. There'll be fish, there'll be wildlife, there'll be birds, and then some of these smaller, a little less obvious critters out there. But obviously, these also fit in the food chain somewhere, if not provide important ecological functions. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basic criteria for creating habitat for wildlife. And of course, I think where we should start with is food. Everybody's got to eat. I break food down into 5 or 6 categories. Browse, and so this is mostly for the ungulates out there, be the grasses, shrubs that these species browse on for forage. Mast is a general term for berries and nuts, so shrubs and trees that provide a diversity of fruits and nuts. Pollen, this is going to be more for the insects, but also for certain birds like the hummingbird, ensuring that we have enough shrubs and trees, flowering shrubs and trees out there that provide a source of pollen throughout the majority of the year. Another food, of course, is fauna, other wildlife. And let's not forget insects, since obviously birds and a lot of other wildlife species, forage on insects. Decomposing organic matter, also an important food source for our primary decomposers, back to the insects, slugs out there. So having a diversity of decaying organic matter, again, back to big down logs or logs decaying at different rates. And then lastly, water. And obviously not every forest land out there is going to be able to provide water. Some will have it inherently. Some you might be able to enhance a water source. Or some, if you're just sitting high and dry, you don't really have the opportunity to do anything to improve water. The second important habitat feature I generally describe as just structure. The overall composition and structure and structural qualities of a forest. Contrasting this photo, a very structurally complex forest, both spatially, looking at the distribution of trees, obviously a lot of down wood, a little hard to see in the picture, but dead trees, snags, diverse understory, young trees coming up beneath older trees, all characteristics of a structurally complex forest that can be contrasted with, again, a very homogeneous plantation that has poor structural diversity. So a few key points about forest structure: improving or creating a multi-layered canopy. One of the things that I learned early on in practicing forestry is that if you want to increase bird diversity in your forest, you should increase the horizontal layering, the horizontal strata within your forest. Reason being is different insect species forage at different strata, different layers in the canopy, and those different insects bring in different bird species. So just by creating a more multi-layered complex forest canopy, you'll begin attracting more wildlife. I already talked about creating snags and or retaining existing snags in down logs. Lots of ways to replicate snags and down logs if you don't have that kind of material in your forest. I'm not sure if I have a photo in here. Seems like a glaring omission since it's one of my hallmarks, but a wildlife habitat pile where you take small diameter wood and stack it up 10 feet wide, 6 feet tall to make a wildlife habitat pile that to a certain degree approximates some of the functions of down logs. creating some spaces for small mammals as well as small songbirds. Creating gaps in your forest. Again, this is getting back to the idea of introducing early successional habitat, shrub habitat within the forest. So if you have a continuous forest cover with very few gaps in there, coming in and punching in a small hole, do this as part of your commercial harvesting. You can basically create a mini clear cut, a half acre, 1 acre, 2 acre, whatever your property lends itself to, gap in the forest that allows sunlight to get down in there, stimulate shrub development that brings in, again, all sorts of insects and wildlife. Increasing edge within your forest. Part of that is, again, creating some gaps. We know that the edges of forests where there's sunlight coming in, interfacing with the forest, creates opportunities for all sorts of, again, shrub diversity. And it tends to be a much more wildlife rich portion of the forest. And then also maintaining forests of variable density. This photo, I think, is a great example of that. It has areas of high density, areas of low density. That kind of variability also creates habitat opportunities for wildlife. Areas of high density tend to provide shelter for mammals and small birds. Areas that are more open allow flyaways for birds to get through. Also likely a more porous canopy that increases forage in the understory. So if you have sufficient acreage, you can really begin playing with variable density across your forest. Oh, there's my habitat pile. Of course I did. Of course I included that. So this is a textbook wildlife habitat pile, and there's some architectural significance to it that I'll point out. If you look at this, the bottom courses of this habitat pile have comparatively larger diameter poles that then, as the pile gets higher, graduate to smaller branches on top. And the reason for this is the poles down at the bottom create some interstitial spaces that small mammals can get into for denning. And then if you pile some branches and fine slash on top, that provides cover for small songbirds. These are great structures to create if you're doing any kind of pre-commercial thinning in your forest, because it's a great way to use up some of the small diameter material, aggregate it. Can also help reduce fire risk as you're minimizing having that cut material spread throughout your entire forest. So just to go back through some of these strategies, creating and retaining snags and coarse-woody debris, creating wildlife habitat piles and constructed down logs. What's a constructed down log, you may ask? If you take some small diameter poles and stack them in parallel, so they create a constructed log that's 20 inches wide and 20 inches tall, those aggregated poles will again provide some of the habitat functions that large down logs would otherwise provide in a forest. Installing nesting boxes. So if you just don't have any larger diameter trees or don't want to sacrifice any trees as snags, certainly you can install nesting boxes. And this is where I think it's really important to talk to either your local Audubon Society or Department of Fish and Wildlife to have a good understanding of what kind of bird species are likely to occupy the forest type you have. So you're putting in nesting boxes appropriate for the birds that are in your area. Planting mast producing trees and shrubs. So again, trees and shrubs that produce berries and nuts. First of all, get a good understanding or identify the ones that are already in your forest. And if there are species that are lacking, then you can be planting some of those underrepresented species to increase more mast producing tree and shrub diversity. Another great strategy is seeding disturbed soils with browse and pollinator mix. We're doing this more and more often now following our logging projects, seeding the log landings, haul roads, skid roads, anywhere that there's disturbed soils, broadcasting that with a mix of seeds for either a browse mix that produces grass or a pollinator mix that provides flowering plants, flowers throughout the year. Talked a little bit about variable density thinning. This can be done both in pre-commercial thinning, but more often in commercial thinning. And this relates to retaining trees that occupy, again, multiple strata in the forest canopy. So as you're thinning, retaining some low trees, retaining mid canopy trees, as well as obviously retaining dominant trees, and then also retaining some defective trees. So this might be hard for some of you to do if you're really trying to optimize timber quality out there. But if you have trees that are forked, if you have trees that have broken off at top or have kind of a platform top to them, or a spike knot coming in, or some kind of what we consider to be defect like that, leaving a few of those out there, because oftentimes those trees will convert into some kind of a wildlife tree, a fork tree. One of the forks may break off, create a point of rot that can create a cavity in the tree that wildlife can get into, things like that. Again, we talked about creating gaps and retaining areas of higher density. So all of these strategies fall into the category, I think, variable density thinning. Back to, again, managing for a mixed species forest, in particular, including hardwoods. In our region, red alder, cherry, big leaf maple, cascara, et cetera, all produce seeds that are important for wildlife forage. Now, another strategy is avoiding major forestry operations during the prime bird nesting season, which is typically considered to be from about the middle of March, later part of March, all the way through the middle of June. So this would mean, avoiding heavy equipment in the woods, logging, things like that, to give wildlife, birds in particular, optimal opportunities for nesting and rearing their young. And then again, the last strategy is just monitoring, getting out there on a regular basis to see what kind of wildlife are using your forest. And if any of these strategies are paying off. So I'm going to leave it at that, and want to open this up for folks to share anecdotes from your own experiences. What are you doing in your woods to enhance habitat or to identify wildlife? Maybe there's something that I've missed, something obvious. And Janet, I see you've got your hand up. I'd love to turn it over to you for a moment.
Oh, thank you. I have just 5 acres in the San Juan Islands at the top of a high cliff, about 250 feet, sheer cliff. So there's some habitat for the birds that like to soar, the turkey vultures and eagles and such. But it's very rocky, and I have some rock piles, and I think they're also habitat for some critters. I see a lot of garter snakes and lizards, and I have a tiny pond, and I get those little green frogs, cute green frogs, whatever they're called. People call them a tree frog. I wondered what diameter coarse woody down wood is good range.
Great question. Yeah, so the wildlife biologists say that to be optimally functional for wildlife, both a standing tree, a snag, and a down log should be a minimum of 20 inches in diameter. And I think they say that because then it provides wildlife opportunities for kind of the whole breadth of wildlife out there. Your pileated woodpeckers need trees that are at least 18 inches in diameter, for instance. However, having worked in the woods for years now, I've noticed even 8-inch diameter trees that have been all pecked, by different types of woodpeckers. So I say, anything you have, the larger the better. But whatever you have, if you don't have snags in your forest, you can go out and girdle the base of a tree. It's just cutting 2 parallel lines, just deep enough to sever the cambium layer, so just a little bit below the bark. If you have the opportunity to get up and top a tree, that's even better because the tree will last longer as a snag. But ideally, I'd say even a diversity of diameter ranges, but generally it's the larger the better.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jay, I see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, I was walking around on our property. We have 20 acres in Quilcene. And I noticed I was looking, it was logged about 30 years ago. So most of the trees are 30 years or so. And I was looking up at, a fir tree, and I noticed that there was a bunch of bark missing up fairly high, I'd say about, 15 feet up. And I hadn't noticed that before. So I walked up to the tree, and then I noticed there was all this bark laying in random places underneath the tree. So I climbed up in the tree, and I could see where there had been a bear had gone up there and ripped the bark off. And, so I Googled it, and, they do that in the spring when there's nothing else to eat. And they lick the sap off of the cambium layer. And, then it said like one bear can damage 70 trees given, the forest, however many trees are in the forest. And they like that age class because the bark is thinner and it's easier for them to chew through it. And maybe there's more sap running in the springtime. And, that was the only tree I noticed. And I have seen bear on our, game cameras. So I know bear go through there, and I figured, well, if a bear kills a couple trees, that's okay with me. It doesn't, it's not going to end my world. And I like sharing the land with the bears. But I just wonder if anybody else has seen damage like that on their property.
Yeah, I've got, let's see, 3 tracts of forest land that all have Doug fir stands on them that are in kind of prime bear browse age. That tends to be anywhere from about 15 to 30 years old or so before the bark in the trees, really gets thick enough that the bear don't seem to prefer it quite as much. I've seen it on my land. Definitely have worked with any number of forest owners that have a wide range of opinions about bear presence in their forest. Some get very literally up in arms about bears and their Doug fir plantations, and have hired either trappers or hunters to come and get them out if they feel like the damage is too excessive. But I'd take the same approach that you do. So far, I haven't seen such significant damage in my forest that I feel like I'm losing timber quality or future timber opportunities. So I'm of the opinion, they get some, I get most of them, all as well.
Mm-hmm.
But for those, if there is anybody out there that's really concerned about bears in young plantations, that's where I'd recommend that you contact your local fish and wildlife biologist and talk about options. Not all options need to be lethal either. There are feeding options that I've heard mixed results on also, but there may be other opportunities out there to deal with them non-lethally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So you said you're up in Quilcene. I forgot that, Jay. Did you receive the announcement for our workshop coming up on July 9th on thinning?
Yeah, I did.
Great.
And I plan on going if my schedule allows it.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Chris, I see you've got the hand up also.
Yes, hi, thanks. So my wife and I have 20 acres north of Stanwood near the Snohomish County and Skagit County line. And it's very diverse. We have some old growth cedar in the back. We have a hayfield out front, deer, coyotes, a lot of bird diversity. But there's one thing we can't figure out, and it's a tunneling animal. And we find these tunnels across the paths through the woods. They're probably, I don't know, about that round, too small for a coyote. I've had some game cameras up there, but can't seem to find what it is. And sometimes there's piles of dirt where they have dug out into make the tunnel, and we just don't know what they might be. Don't know if anyone has any ideas.
Well, my guess would be, if these tunnels go into the forest, my guess would be mountain beaver, given the diameter of hole that you mentioned, as well as the dirt being spit out. Nutria or mountain beaver, look that up. It's actually kind of a fascinating species. It's one of those throwbacks to the Pleistocene. That might be inaccurate, but anyway, they're one of those wildlife critters that has basically not evolved for a million years. They've been around forever, and I've got a lot of mixed feelings about mountain beaver. They have a voracious appetite, so if you have a young plantation, they've been known to wipe out young tree seedlings. They will definitely make your teeth chatter, when you trip in their holes. So they can be perceived as kind of a nuisance, but they also have a fantastic aerating property in the soil, given all the tunnels like that. So I would look that up. I'm not really sure, somebody had mentioned voles. The voles would have a smaller tunnel than that. I don't know any other burrowing animal that would make a hole that large, again, with the soil being spit out like you've described.
Yeah.
So
And
look up mountain beaver boomers. Sometimes we call them boomers.
okay, thanks. And the tunnels tend to be just below the surface.
Yep.
And we'll step on them, and expose some of them.
Yep.
We have a seasonal stream that goes through the hayfield, but the forest doesn't have. It has standing water a little bit in the winters, but other than that, there's no real water source there. So I don't know if it'd be neutrina, but mountain beaver sounds
yeah,
like.
so even though they're called mountain beaver, they actually don't have or require an association with water. They're not an aquatic species. They're entirely an upland species.
All right,
I'm not sure why they were called a beaver, mountain beaver. Probably because, I don't know, somebody named it that and they were wrong, but the name stuck. So, but you can look up nutria, Nutria. And yeah, if I was more of a biologist, I'd give you the Latin name for it, but somebody can look that up.
Okay, thank you.
Jenna, I saw your hand up again. I don't know if that's a residual or if you have another comment or question or.
I can wait till other people have spoken, but I've had all sorts of stuff going on recently. We had a deer mortality incident pretty recently in the San Juans, and adenovirus pandemic lost 95% of the deer. But about a year before that, I fenced in part of my land, and it's just extraordinary what has volunteered. Camas meadows and fawn lilies and all sorts of wonderful wildflowers. We're just waiting to have the deer excluded. And then I had some thinning done just recently by a consulting firm in the San Juans, and I'm really pleased with that result. I have what are called conservation burn piles to burn in the autumn when they've dried out to the right extent. So I have all these, more than a dozen stacks. They're very, very sort of pleasing looking, like the haystacks that Claude Monet painted, the Impressionist painter. And I was wondering, do critters take up residence in these conservation burn piles?
If you just made them, I would kind of doubt that any critter would take up residence that quickly in there. It's possible, but certainly once you get in and start making those fires, I think they'll hightail it out there. One thing I was going to say though, if you've got these burn piles, once the pile is finished, it's going to obviously leave a burn spot on the ground. That is an ideal location to broadcast wildflower seeds or pollinator seeds. We have another member down in Oregon that's been doing that and having a fantastic success in in getting pollinator flower species to take on that sterilized soil or burned soil. So
Oh, great. I wonder if lupins would do well. The deer are coming back and they really eat practically everything here, but they don't bother the lupins. So maybe I'll try lupins.
you bet. Alex, it looks like there were some comments in the chat. I don't know if there were any questions or anything that you want to pull out there.
Kit just clarified that I think she's right. Nutria and mountain beaver are different. I think nutria are invasive and they are aquatic. I know because I've seen them down here at Lake Washington where I live. They're also rodents, but yeah, I think they're distinct.
Two different species. Okay.
Yeah, no other questions. Jay has his hand up again.
Yeah. Let's see. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, we made a bunch of piles with stumps and, you know, small brush, and there was a big pile of small alder that had been piled up, and we cut it up, and then I was gonna burn it in place, but my wife decided we should move it somewhere else. So we moved this huge pile. And, you know, I've been looking at it and it's been there a couple of years now and it's really rotting down. You know, we've thrown grass and all kinds of stuff on it. And, you know, so I keep thinking, well, I'd like to get rid of this pile, but, you know, now I think probably it's got a lot of different things living in it. You know, like you say, it's probably become a wildlife haven for bugs and everything else. And now I'm like, maybe I should just leave it there and maybe add to it and let it just, you know, be a home to the critters, but it's kind of taking up some space that I didn't really want to have a pile in, you know. But I guess you just, you know, once it's there for a while, stuff's going to move into it.
That's for sure. Yeah, I know some folks that have got a perpetual wildlife habitat piles. You know, it's where they stack all their slash whenever they generate it. So, you know, every year, every couple of years, you know, they kind of top it off, if you will, with more slash. I think that's a great way to go, just to maintain that kind of permanent habitat structure out there. Yeah, if you have the opportunity to locate it, you know, out of the way or somewhere more convenient, that's great. You know, it sounds like you've already, you know, got one established that, yeah, that may not be quite as advisable to move, but
Yeah. Think about where you want to make them, I guess, before you make them, you know.
Well, it's actually is a good point. You know, so to the point of locating habitat piles, you know, if you have a gap in your forest, that's a great place to put it. You usually don't want to put the piles directly underneath any trees. You know, should they catch fire, you know, that's going to carry fire up into the trees. Certainly don't want to stack any of that material against the base of a tree. It could introduce rot. So if you're looking at building them in your forest somewhere, look for some kind of a gap, or at least well away from other trees. And then also, if you can build them close to any kind of a water source, be it a wetland or a stream, then that habitat pile can also provide refugia for amphibians that are occupying that surface water. So just a couple other pro tips for locating your habitat piles. Chris, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, one more question. So we commonly have coyotes passing through our land. They seem to always be there. We have some trails, a perimeter trail and a central trail, and they just use those as highways like the deer do. But we're in there in the summers with family and friends and grandkids, and there's some dogs that we have too. So my question is, how is it best to cohabitate with coyotes? I mean, we see them, they're always far away. They never get near us, but I suspect they have dens in there and are having pups. Are there any common sense rules on how to cohabitate with them?
Well, I guess from my experience, we've got a lot of coyote down near what I consider my homestead property, where my family has our cabin. And in talking with the neighbors that live down there and truly cohabitate with the coyote, two observations. One is the coyote are going to look out for themselves. very adaptable species, very savvy. I wouldn't worry too much about bothering them unless you have an extremely aggressive dog. And the reason I emphasize extremely aggressive is a neighbor of mine had a schnauzer. I don't know dogs. Schnauzer. Anyway, you can picture it, fluffy beard. And the coyotes came into their yard in the evening, and the female coyotes lured this schnauzer out, and then the male coyotes came in and killed them off. So that tells me that these coyotes are savvy and aggressive in their own right. And one way to, I think, to cohabitate is to really make sure that you're keeping your wildlife or your pets, close at hand. But I almost, say that, coyotes are a distant kin to rabbits, just in the way that they proliferate. They breed very successfully, and just seem to be a highly, highly adaptable species. I live just up on the east side of downtown Olympia, even though I have forest land out a ways. And we have coyote that come right through our yard here in Olympia. So, again, amazingly adaptable species. I would just do everything you can to, protect your pets from them, and then not worry about having any kind of adverse impact on them. They'll
Okay.
adapt.
Thanks. We typically see them, they don't want to be around us. We've never surprised one. We always see them at 100 yards or more away. But we just are not sure how to, keep track of. We don't keep track of them, but we just don't want to surprise them.
Yeah, I think they're, being the, should I say, I don't want to say sensitive isn't the right word, highly aware. They're a highly aware species. So it'll be very hard for you to startle them or surprise them. They'll know you're coming well before you know that they're there. And they tend to be, extremely shy animals, unless you're letting your pets out at night or something. They'd be one of the least wildlife species that I would be concerned about having an adverse impact on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else out there that hasn't chimed in yet have any thoughts on wildlife enhancement or strategies? Otherwise, I'll go back to where we've got a vocal minority here, which is perfectly fine. But
I want to throw a word out for bats, because a lot of the same habitat enhancements, Kirk, you were talking about that are useful for birds, like creating snags and retaining trees that have the fork tops and cavities in them, are really useful for bats too. And as long as you have like a pretty open freshwater source somewhere in your forest, like a pond that's bigger than 15 feet or a river, you probably have bats, because they're all over Washington and Oregon. And bat houses are another thing you can build that are super useful for bats, that to help, they roost in them during the day, and they use them for feeding roosts. And yeah, bats are really cool. And they need our help. They're pretty threatened here. So
Yep. Yeah, just on one thing I should remind folks of, and I always plug this at each workshop, each fireside chat. The NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, has a funding program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. And EQIP, you can apply for funding through EQIP to implement a broad range of these wildlife habitat enhancement functions. So you can get funding to create snags, you can get funding to create down logs, you can get funding for wildlife habitat piles, for planting more diverse trees and shrubs for wildlife, for actually creating gaps in your forest, creating ponds if your landscape is conducive to retaining water, all sorts of things like that. So, all of these habitat enhancement activities don't necessarily need to come at your expense. you can get cost share funding from the federal government to improve wildlife habitat on your land, and a lot more practices that I didn't mention. I'd be happy to talk to you about the program if you want to contact me at some other point, if you're not already familiar with it. With that, I'll go back one more time to Janet and then to Jay, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
So I put a link about urban coyotes in Seattle in the chat, and they're really intelligent and adaptable. They tend to avoid people. People don't even know they're living, coexisting with them. Another thing is I had a paper wasp nest about 7 feet from my garage person door, and they never bothered me. I just, was respectful of them. And there was something in that context with this murder hornet, it's called, that's arrived from Asia in this area in southern British Columbia. And they said that the murder hornets, especially like the paper wasp larvae, or whatever they're called, grubs. So they're asking people who have paper wasp nests to monitor them every week and send in the results to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife site. I thought that was interesting. Anyway, they're really good. They eat mosquitoes and things like that. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Jay, do you have one last comment or a question or anecdote?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, we have a lot of coyote around here, and they run around, and, I've seen them hunting cats, but I've never seen them kill anything. But one day I was sitting on my porch, and this husky came walking down the street with a dead cat in its jaws, and it dug a hole in my neighbor's yard and dropped the cat in the hole and buried it and went on its way. So, all canines are capable of killing small animals. So, coyotes are no different than any other dog or critter.
Sure. Okay. All right, folks. Well, it's just a minute past 8:30, so perfect timing. We're going to wrap it up here. Thanks for joining us, and everybody, thanks for sharing your comments and strategies as well. Like Alex mentioned, she's going to send out an email to everyone that is chock full of resources on wildlife. So take a look for that, and hope you join us again next month for our next Fireside Chat. I have no idea what the topic's going to be, so I can't wait to find out. But we'll see you then. Until then, have a great night.
Thank you.